You've just seen it. Wads of cash stuffed inside instant noodle boxes, hidden among everyday groceries, in a warehouse that looked like any other. But behind the baked beans and biscuits was something far bigger, a sophisticated industrial-scale money laundering operation that had quietly cleaned hundreds of millions of pounds for organized crime. Between May and November 2020, 4 men oversaw the movement of an eye-watering £266 million through a fake business empire that spanned the UK and the UAE. They weren't drug dealers or gangsters on the street. They were the money men, quietly turning dirty cash into clean profit for syndicates who didn't want their fingerprints anywhere near the cash. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity: vans, storage units, and trusted couriers. Thousands of vacuum-sealed bundles of notes hidden in plain sight. They called it logistics. The authorities called it the biggest known money laundering operation of its kind ever uncovered in the UK. This is the story of how 4 men, hiding behind laptops, rental cars, and cardboard boxes, thought they could outsmart the system, and how a single raid tore the whole thing down. The unit sat quietly on the edge of an industrial park in Leeds, the kind of location that rarely drew attention. Between a bulk tile supplier and a small haulage company, the nondescript building with corrugated metal shutters looked like it housed car parts, bottled drinks, or discount electronics. Nothing about it screamed suspicious. And that's exactly what the men behind it wanted. Inside, however, it was a different story. Stacked floor to ceiling were pallets of food boxes, instant noodles, pasta bags, tea, coffee tins, cereal packets. On the surface, it looked like a wholesale operation, ready to supply corner shops or community markets. But beneath the top layer of product, carefully hidden inside sealed cartons, was cold, hard cash. Bundles of £20 and £50 notes had been vacuum sealed, shrink wrapped, and tucked deep inside the boxes. Each parcel had been weighed and labeled with precision. Some of them were wrapped so tightly that officers later said they felt like bricks. They weren't just hiding cash, they were preparing it for export, buried inside what appeared to be completely legitimate consignments. It wasn't random, everything was methodical. The boxes were stacked with clear labels, manifest sheets were attached to pallets, and the paperwork all looked official. The operation had been disguised as a food distribution business, but no food ever left the building. Only money. CCTV footage showed a rotating crew of men entering the unit in vans, unloading holdalls, and leaving within minutes. Sometimes they wore high-vis jackets, other times they were dressed casually, just enough to blend in. They weren't shouting, didn't linger, and never returned the same way twice. They operated like professionals, quiet, efficient, invisible. Police would later confirm that in the span of just 6 months, over £50 million in cash had moved through this single unit alone. It was part of a much larger laundering machine, a network stretching from Yorkshire to the West Midlands and even as far as Dubai. But for all its secrecy, the operation had one weakness: scale. Moving that much cash, that frequently eventually left a trail, and all it took was one anonymous tip, a whisper about suspicious activity on the estate, for the National Crime Agency to start watching. What they discovered would blow open the UK's biggest known cash-based money laundering ring. At the center of the operation were 4 men, not gangsters with gold chains and flashy sports cars, but ordinary-looking professionals who understood one thing better than most: how to move money without leaving a trace. First was Arfan Iqbal, 40 years old, from Leeds. He was seen as the ringleader, the one who coordinated the movement of cash between storage units, drop-off locations, and eventual export channels. He wasn't loud or brash. He kept a low profile, lived quietly, and didn't draw unnecessary attention. But his fingerprints were all over the operation. When authorities began tracking van movements and encrypted messages, Iqbal's name came up again and again. Then came Ranjit Singh, 49, from Southall in West London. Singh had a background in transport and logistics, which made him the perfect man to manage the flow of vans across the country. Using rented vehicles and pre-planned drop points, he helped ensure that millions in street cash moved across cities without raising alarms. According to prosecutors, Singh played a key role in collecting and consolidating cash before it was delivered to the warehouse in Leeds. Mohammed Aslam, 56, also from Leeds, was the third cog in the machine. He handled communications and links to external contacts, including overseas operatives suspected of involvement in the UAE. Police found multiple encrypted devices in his possession, as well as detailed logs of cash deliveries. Aslam wasn't flashy either. He presented himself as a normal businessman, but digital evidence later revealed that he had overseen the packing and movement of over £100 million. The last man was Syed Bukhari, 39, from Slough. He played a quieter role, but was just as critical. Bukhari operated safe houses, helped organize clean drivers, and oversaw several of the warehouse shipments. He was methodical, careful not to appear too involved, but police surveillance eventually linked him to a string of deliveries and warehouse visits, including one where over £2 million in vacuum-sealed notes was being boxed for transit. These weren't stereotypical money launderers. They weren't mob bosses or enforcers. They were specialists, the kind of people criminal empires rely on to clean the cash and stay out of sight. No tattoos, no weapons, just phones, vans, spreadsheets, and silence. What made their operation so dangerous wasn't just the amount of money, it was the speed, scale, and structure. These men weren't making mistakes. They weren't bragging online. They understood how to hide in plain sight. But even the best laid plans leave traces. And as the National Crime Agency started to dig deeper, cracks began to appear. One of their key advantages, speed, would soon become their downfall. To understand how this crew managed to clean £266 million, you need to look at their logistics, not just what they did, but how they did it. The operation was layered like an onion. On the outside, it looked like a regular supply chain. Rental vans traveled up and down the UK. Cardboard boxes were loaded and unloaded at storage units, lockups, and industrial sites. Labels were printed, manifests were filled out. Surveillance footage showed nothing unusual. But the truth lay in the details. The crew used a web of shell companies, most of them fake import-export businesses. On paper, they dealt in rice, pasta, tinned food, and snack boxes. These firms had company numbers, registered offices, VAT numbers, all the right paperwork. But no real business ever took place. They were fronts, designed purely to move cash, disguised as goods. Drivers were vetted and rotated. No one person knew the full scale of the operation. A man might be hired to pick up stock in Birmingham and drive it to Leeds, unaware that the sealed cartons in his boot contained £500,000 in drug money. All of it was coordinated through encrypted messaging apps, often using multiple burner phones and alias names. The team even had cleanup crews, people tasked with disposing of boxes, burner phones, and data logs after shipments were made. If a van was used more than twice, it was returned and swapped for another rental under a different name. The cars were cleaned, the devices wiped, and the routes changed every few weeks. But the real brilliance of the scheme lay in its export model. Once the cash was packed into sealed boxes, it was labeled as food or household goods and shipped overseas, most often to Dubai. There, it could be converted into gold, cryptocurrency, or clean financial assets through offshore accounts and real estate. Investigators believed that the network was part of a broader system that linked British drug money to money launderers operating across the Middle East. Everything was timed. Deliveries happened at precise hours. Drivers used lookouts and relay systems to avoid detection. Warehouse visits were always short. No one stayed longer than necessary. Most never even spoke. They wore gloves, masks, and kept their heads down. And yet, despite all this precision, the one thing they couldn't erase was movement. Phone records, vehicle trackers, CCTV sightings. Slowly, the web began to reveal itself. For months, the National Crime Agency watched. They followed the vans, they tapped into the digital trails, they let the men operate freely, building a bigger case every day. Then came the moment where quiet surveillance turned into a full-blown operation, and everything started crashing down. By late 2020, the National Crime Agency had enough suspicions to escalate their investigation. What began as a vague tip-off about suspicious activity in a Leeds warehouse had ballooned into something far larger. Officers weren't just watching one building, they were watching an ecosystem. And now the paper trail was becoming digital. The NCA formed a task force focused solely on Project Poseidon, the code name for their growing money laundering case. Their target? A covert financial network moving cartel-level cash across the UK and abroad. The team began tracing financial transactions between the bogus import-export companies set up by the four men. Dozens of bank accounts had been opened under different business names. Some showed large incoming deposits, followed by rapid transfers to accounts in the UAE, Spain, and Eastern Europe. The scale of the money movement was staggering. But what caught their attention most were the frequent patterns, small mistakes repeated over time, reused email addresses, duplicate invoice formats, similar courier logs. Even though the group had taken steps to avoid detection, humans are creatures of habit. And slowly the digital evidence stacked up. Then came a breakthrough. During a routine surveillance pass, officers spotted a familiar rented van pulling into a commercial unit in Slough. It was the same vehicle seen outside the Leeds warehouse 2 weeks prior. A deeper dive revealed that the rental account was linked to Ranjit Singh, and it had been used on over 30 documented trips in just 3 months. That van was the thread investigators needed. Using ANPR, automatic number plate recognition data, they mapped the vehicle's movements from Leeds to Birmingham, Slough to Luton, and finally Heathrow. The frequency and timing of these trips matched known dates where cash was believed to have been moved or exported. The walls were closing in. Next, they turned to the phones. Each of the suspects had used encrypted communication platforms, primarily EncroChat and other off-grid messaging apps. But despite their efforts to stay hidden, forensic experts managed to retrieve fragments of deleted data from one seized device. Among the recovered messages were references to food orders, drop-off lists, and packed pallets, all coded language but unmistakably about cash. The most damning message? A line that read, 4.2 million in, packed, another 3 boxes on Tuesday, same spot. It wasn't enough for arrests yet, but it told investigators one thing: a new drop was imminent. If they moved now, they'd risk spooking the group, but if they waited just a bit longer, they could catch them red-handed. And so the NCA prepared their next move. Over a dozen officers were placed on rotating surveillance shifts. The Leeds warehouse, the van routes, the phones, everything was being monitored in real time. The team wasn't just watching anymore, they were preparing to strike. It was November 16th, 2020, a grey Monday morning in West Yorkshire. At exactly 9:15 a.m., a white Ford Transit van rolled into the industrial estate in Leeds. Inside, 2 men sat quietly, no radio, no chatter. In the back, sealed boxes lined the floor, taped, labeled, and shrink-wrapped like grocery stock. But officers watching from an unmarked car across the road knew exactly what was inside. This wasn't a delivery run, it was the final piece of the puzzle. Minutes after the van pulled in, the warehouse shutter opened. Another man stepped out, clipboard in hand, acting like a store manager receiving a shipment. The performance was neat, polished even, but the NCA had already seen too much. At 9:22 a.m., the order came through. Go, go, go. Unmarked vehicles flooded the industrial park. Officers wearing black tactical gear surrounded the building. Armed units stormed the premises, quickly restraining the men inside. There was no resistance, just silence, and the sharp sound of cable ties being fastened. What they found inside was exactly what they had expected, but on a scale even they hadn't imagined. Dozens of boxes, stacked and sorted, each filled with vacuum-sealed bricks of cash. In total, over £5 million was seized from just that one location. That same morning, coordinated raids took place across Leeds, Slough, Southall, Luton, and West Bromwich. Safe houses were breached, storage units opened, and mobile devices, burner phones, laptops, and encrypted drives were seized by the dozen. By the end of the day, all 4 suspects, Arfan Iqbal, Ranjit Singh, Mohammed Aslam, and Syed Bukhari, were in custody. Back at NCA headquarters, officers began logging evidence: £5 million recovered from the Leeds warehouse, £1.2 million from a lockup in Luton, £900,000 from a safe in Southall, dozens of fake shipping labels, packing lists, and company documents. Altogether, the cash and assets seized during the raids exceeded £8.4 million. But investigators knew that this was just a fraction of the total. By their estimate, over £266 million had passed through the network in just 8 months. And it wasn't just money. The metadata on phones revealed voice notes, contact lists linked to Dubai-based fixers, and a string of codes used to track incoming and outgoing parcels. One phone even contained a draft email referring to next month's exports, a clear sign the group had no plans of stopping. In interviews, all 4 men denied knowledge. They claimed they were handling legitimate goods and didn't know what was inside the boxes, but their stories didn't match. Timelines broke down, devices told a different truth. The NCA had them, not just with fingerprints or footage, but with logistics, records, and digital trails that painted a crystal clear picture. The sting was complete. Now it was time to bring the case to court and show the scale of what had been uncovered. The courtroom was packed when the 4 men finally stood trial in 2023 at Leeds Crown Court. The case had taken nearly 3 years to prepare, not because the evidence was lacking, but because the scale of it was so vast. Prosecutors described it as the most sophisticated and industrial-size money laundering conspiracy ever brought before a UK court. Sitting in the dock were Arfan Iqbal, Ranjit Singh, Mohammed Aslam, and Syed Bukhari, 4 men who had never fired a gun, never been caught with drugs, and never run a street-level operation. And yet, they had helped move more money than some of the UK's most notorious crime families. The prosecution laid out the full operation in chilling detail. £266 million laundered between May and November 2020. More than 83 separate cash deliveries tracked via CCTV, GPS, and ANPR data. At least 2 tons of physical banknotes moved in sealed boxes. Fake companies registered under false names. Repeated trips to the UAE with connections to suspected money brokers in Dubai. The jury was shown footage of the cash-filled boxes being packed in food warehouses, stills from surveillance of van handovers, and digital maps of how the vehicles moved across England. They were also presented with emails, encrypted messages, and invoices with obviously fabricated entries. Things like 32 boxes of biscuits that were never ordered, never delivered, and never meant for consumption. Each man had a different defense. Iqbal claimed he ran a logistics company and had no idea what was in the boxes. Singh said he was just a courier following instructions. Aslam argued he was an investor, not a handler. Bukhari maintained he had only helped out a friend, but the jury didn't buy it. The coordination was too tight, the timing too perfect, and the evidence too overwhelming. The judge was scathing in his sentencing remarks. This was not just money laundering, he said, it was the industrialization of criminal finance. You were the bankers for Britain's underworld, and you used logistics and deception to enable untold damage, violence, addiction, exploitation, funded through this cash. You thought you were invisible. You were wrong. Arfan Iqbal received 15 years, the longest sentence reflecting his role as the mastermind. Ranjit Singh was sentenced to 12 years for managing the courier network. Mohammed Aslam got 9 years for handling communications and warehouse operations. Syed Bukhari was jailed for 7 years for facilitating storage and transport. Together, they were handed a combined 43 years in prison. But the fallout didn't end there. The NCA launched Proceeds of Crime Act proceedings to seize assets, properties, and luxury items linked to the operation. Over £4.5 million in vehicles, jewelry, and real estate was frozen. And in Dubai, authorities, working with the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, began tracing accounts and shell firms suspected of receiving the laundered funds. It was clear this case was just the beginning of something far larger. The 4 men had been caught, the operation dismantled, but the network they fed and the money they moved left a trail that stretched across borders, continents, and criminal empires. When the final sentence was handed down and the courtroom emptied, it marked the end of a single operation, but not the war.